Hi, everybody. My name is Rosalie Rolone Dow. I'm Associate Professor in the College of Education, as well as Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Diversity. Welcome to the Center for the Study of Diversity Spring Lecture Series on Campus Climate. I promise spring is coming. It is a spring lecture series. It's really just around the corner. Just think how far we've come from last Tuesday. And it's my pleasure to be introducing today's speaker. Dr. Alicia Dowd is Professor of Education at Penn State University's Center for the Study of Higher Education. Her research focuses on political economic issues of racial and ethnic equity in college student experiences and outcomes, organizational change, accountability, and the factors affecting student attainment in higher education. From 2009 to 2015, Dr. Dowd, sorry, my last name is Dow without a D, so Dr. Dowd co-directed the Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California, where she was instrumental in developing the Equity Scorecard, the center's signature action research process. She is the co-author with Estela Mara Ben-Simon of Engaging the Race Question, Accountability, and Equity in U.S. Higher Education, which you can see here and purchase in the front of the room. Her research has also been published in numerous journals, including the Review of Educational Research, Harvard Educational Review, the Research in Higher Education Journal, and Teachers College Record. Dr. Dowd's list of funding sources is also rather impressive. She's received funding from the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, and the Lumina Foundation for Education. I'm drawn to Dr. Dowd's work because of its particular focus on racial equity in higher education. Her book speaks to the importance of broad diversity initiatives, but she makes a compelling case for the need for concerted attention in higher education on race, racism, and its intersection with equity. How do these understandings get played out in policy and practice in the daily life of a university? How do members of different racial groups access or experience opportunity within a university? Just easy questions, you know. Dr. Dowd brings extensive expertise to the difficult work of answering these questions through the Equity Scorecard process. This process has been implemented in a variety of community colleges and four-year universities across a range of states, from California to North Carolina to Wisconsin. Over 40 colleges and universities have engaged with the Equity Scorecard process for a year or longer. And additionally, another 40 post-secondary institutions have used the scorecard tools in day-long or half-day professional development workshops. While transformative institutional change for greater racial equity is challenging work, there are concrete ways that this work can be moved forward. I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Alicia Dowd, who will share her journey and expertise conducting the important work of advancing racial equity in and through higher education. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Dow, Dr. Jones, the Center for the Study of Diversity, and all of the wonderful people that I've met here during my time today in a series of meetings with individuals in offices across the campus that are asking themselves, how can we address equity issues? How can we build on our institutional commitment to diversity and inclusiveness to promote equity? And so I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk with you today to share insights from my work, my research. And I am a professor of education, and I'm an action researcher, and I also use case study methods and a variety of all kinds of different research and developmental evaluation methods to ask what is the responsibility of institutions of higher education to address issues of racism and institutionalized racism in American society. Anyone in the United States today must acknowledge that racism is very much a part of our society and that it plagues our abilities to create a healthy and well-functioning society. So the notion of engaging the race question in higher education is asking the question, what can colleges and universities and people in them, like ourselves, do to advance an equity agenda? And so today I'll be sharing some of the insights from my research. As was mentioned, for 6 years, I was co-director of the Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California. And for 10 years, I was a faculty member at USC. And so just 12 months ago, I moved to Penn State University, which is a very different setting. But I continue my relationship with the Center for Urban Education, which I will also refer to as CUE from time to time. And CUE is the home of the Equity Scorecard. The Equity Scorecard is a 2-year action research process that is intended to facilitate this type of equity-minded inquiry that we believe can be a resource for promoting equity. And when we talk about tools and conducting socially conscious research and developing the tools that institutions need to promote racial equity, we're using that in a cultural sense, in an acknowledgement that we're all part of a particular culture. Those higher education cultures localized in particular places, like here at the University of Delaware. And there are also shared characteristics across higher education that identify what does it mean to be a college and what does it mean to be a college student. And so part of being an action researcher is to become like an anthropologist of your own setting and to kind of try to see your own culture and cultural practices with new eyes, with a new fresh lens, and to ask why are these our cultural practices and in what ways are they equitable or inequitable? In what ways are they contributing to the reproduction of the racial disparities that we see in participation and success in college and in degree attainment and graduate attainment and entry into the professoriate. So this is what the Center for Urban Education has been focused on and very deeply engaged with. The founder and the current director and my co-director when I was at the Center for Urban Ed is Estela Mara Ben-Simon, as mentioned, and she's the co-author with me of Engaging the Race Question, Accountability and Equity in U.S. Higher Education, which is available for sale on Amazon.com, and perhaps even of more immediate salience, it's right here. So that's super fun for me to be able to share that. I was so lucky to have a sabbatical where I was able to go and take a really focused time to give thought to what I had learned from partnering with faculty, staff, and administrators in California, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, all across the country, about what does it mean to talk about equity and to talk about race, and to do that in a way that's constructive, that's actually productive towards advancing equity, as opposed to degenerating into name calling or blame calling. So this shares some of our insights, and I'll be building on that work today. When we talk about equity, immediately we bring different conceptions of what equity means. So equity is an abstract concept. It refers to a state of affairs that we would consider fair or just. And all of us have sort of an inherent sense of fairness. It's like if you're a parent, you know that kids will fight, right? So if one gets a cupcake and the other doesn't get the cupcake, well, now you have that's not fair kind of situation playing out. And that was a big thing in my family because Sister A didn't talk to Brother B for about 10 years over the cupcake incident. But to engage the race question and to talk about racial equity, we're going to have to work past those really kind of childish, inherent, instinctive notions of fairness and unfairness that are combative, to stepping back and thinking about our history in higher ed and the current and contemporary practices that are contributing to a state of affairs that is inequitable. There are many types of equity that we're concerned about. We're concerned about equity for working class students. We're concerned about equity for people who are differently abled. We're concerned about gender equity in the sciences, for example. And I'll be focused on racial equity because it's necessary to focus on race and equity as its own particular kind of set of problems, because if we don't, there's a real tendency in practice settings, professional settings, to not talk about race, that's difficult. And so we'll talk about inclusiveness or diversity instead. And don't get me wrong, diversity, inclusiveness, respect for difference is very important. Okay, so to tease out a little bit, what do I mean by equity? Here's a series of slides. So first of all, equity does not mean equal. So back to the cupcakes, it doesn't mean you get a cupcake, I get a cupcake. So that would be equal, okay. So that's an inherent sense of fairness. So when we talk about equity, it's not just about equality. Equality would be a fair standard of equity if you have a situation where people have equal needs. So there's a concept, horizontal equity. To those with equal needs, give equal resources. So fair enough to give one cupcake to each child. That's fair, that's equitable. But the idea, I'll treat everyone equally, is a colorblind approach. It's an approach that is not acknowledging the fact that for decades we had legal, longer than centuries, legal segregation, legal discrimination against racial and ethnic minoritized groups in the United States, and therefore, treating everyone equally is not grounded in the reality of the situation. So we want to move past I treat everyone equally. So if the world isn't equal, then as opposed to in the previous slide where it would be nice to have the kind of context. As a faculty member, I have students coming, I build a ladder to their success, they earn their degrees, it's a great system, right? But that's not the world we live in. The world isn't equal. And so resources are inequitably distributed in different schools and settings and communities. And that can include access to a rich curriculum, to AP courses, to honors courses. And this is probably not news to any of you, that these opportunities are not fairly distributed. So if we start from a position of inequality, such as represented here, with some students are halfway up the ladder to that college degree before the others have even stepped onto the ladder. So the world isn't equal. And in addition, for some students, they're experiencing systemic bias, implicit bias, racism, and that these biases, in addition to representing sort of a ladder that's a lot taller, I guess I even have a pointer, but okay. So, and then there's sort of this hole here. See, like, there's a hole that one has to dig out of. And in higher ed, we tend to think, well, we didn't dig that hole. That's K-12. That's higher ed. That's the community. Where the students are coming to us. They're not prepared. They're not motivated. They're not able. So it's a motivation gap, or it's an ability gap. Well, the fact is we are contributing to digging that hole. And we contribute in different ways. Sometimes our practices are equitable, and sometimes they're inequitable. We're contributing to digging the hole and providing only broken ladders. So that occurs when we're holding low expectations for students of color based on implicit bias. It's based in our history and our enduring racial discrimination, racial stereotypes. And those low expectations play out in ways that are causing the problems that we can address by actually committing to tackling them. A diversity lens, while valuable and important, is a distinct agenda. So the diversity agenda is important, but it's a distinct and different agenda from an equity agenda. So diversity brings more and more students onto broken pathways. So we may just be gathering people along these broken ladders, just to really play out that metaphor there. So if we engage in equity work, then we're really talking about looking at our own practices, committing to an institutional responsibility to equity goals, and saying, well, how are we going to fix these broken ladders? And some of the core principles of the equity scorecard and action research that I've been involved in is using disaggregated data, first of all, so that you can actually see problems that are occurring among racial ethnic groups and access, participation, and resource distribution. Providing professional development for faculty and staff to become equity agents. This can be kind of fun. It can be kind of creative and generative. So this isn't all bad news or kind of a sad story. It's about creating the third way. It's creating a way that's actually a better, higher quality educational system that serves students of diverse backgrounds. So diversity and equity agenda is not mutually exclusive. Equity agenda focus on income and class is not always or necessarily in competition with an equity agenda focus on race and ethnicity. Sometimes these agendas are quite intertwined, but other times there's a higher and a negative disparate impact, or negative disparate impact that is occurring that's facing students of color because all the challenges of having fewer economic resources are compounded when you're subject to racial discrimination. So these are some of the strategies for repairing these broken ladders. And to illustrate what I mean a little bit more, I have a couple of stories to tell you. And I will apologize in advance because I've been talking with many of you throughout the day. Some of these stories have sort of trickled out, in pieces. So here's the story of Old Main University. And it's a story of organizational learning and change towards equity. And when we think about action research, it really it's a process of learning. It's a process of knowledge production. And so learning is key. And part of learning is always unlearning. And it's always understanding your learner, where are they coming from? Where are they starting on this journey to learn something new? And people, as I mentioned, so we have this inherent sense of fairness. It can be quite simple. That's not fair. But then there are other cultural scripts that tell us what does it mean to be fair. And those cultural scripts include what I have described in the book with Estella as justice is fairness. So this is like, what is fair? It's kind of it's like a notion of how far do we need to go? What's our responsibility in higher ed to create a level playing field? So there's that kind of conceptualization. There's also justice is care. Many practitioners get into education because they have a very caring orientation and they want to serve all students well. And this can be a valuable starting point to engage in equity work together. Justice is care, a caring perspective. But when care is pity, and a sense that the privileged will help the at-risk, you're not getting off on the right foot. Because care as pity will always impose a cost on those who are pitied. So there's a notion of authentic care. Authentic care is about setting high expectations, and it's about being in an empowering relationship, whether it's teacher and student, or a staff member and financial aid recipient. That authentic care can be distinguished from care as pity. And that's an important distinction because that dynamic of at-risk and underprivileged imposes a sort of notion of a culture of poverty, which is really a discredited approach today. All right, so at Old Main University, it's a comprehensive university. This is a pseudonym. And Old Main is one of 14 institutions that are part of a state system, a public system of higher education. And at Old Main, the leaders at the state system, very much like many of you I've been in conversation with today, we're saying, well, how can we increase our diversity of African American students and Latino students in particular? How can we increase our retention rates? How can we meet accountability goals that we voluntarily presented to our legislature because we want to inspire their confidence that we are a strong, high-quality educational system? And so those leaders met with their provosts, and the provosts invited Estella Benjamin and I to come, and we talked with them about the scorecard process, and they said, we'd like to do that here at our universities. So they all got together, and they convened evidence teams. And evidence teams are groups of 10 to 12 people who are brought together to basically learn on behalf of their institutions. They're asked to learn about equity. They're asked to have these conversations. Well, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you? And the argument will always come out, well, why should we focus on race? And these are opportunities for this group of 10 or 12 people to develop a language to start to present in forums like this one, to go to their department meetings, to be part of an accreditation self-study, to be in the strategic planning group. All the work that we do is regular routines of higher ed, and to have that conversation again and again, and to become more competent in expressing, articulating, and really making the case for commitment to racial equity. So they said, well, we've got lots of data, and I understand that you have a lot of data here as well. You've got a lot of data. It's there. You can use it. You have been using it, which is great. And so we are here, and it's like, well, how do we take action with these data? What do we do? How do we make a scorecard? Why should we make a scorecard? Who should do it? Where should we do it? So all kinds of nuts and bolts questions. And I'm really so excited to be here and encouraged because you're asking such great questions right now. I feel like the momentum, the energy is building. You want to get to a more equitable future. So some of the themes that I've reiterated and that I'll try to illustrate through this story of Old Main University is getting to the actionable N in your data. The actionable N is data that's tied to practice. So I'm a professor, I teach classes. So if I see that a student who took my class is not successful at the next class, I'd like to know, well, what did I not do to help that student succeed in the next class? If I see systematically and over time that there are racial and ethnic gaps in the students who are successful and not successful, then I want to understand what is it that I'm doing that leads me to be inequitable in my practices. And that's a process of inquiry. So inquiry is the strategy of using data in ways that are actionable. It's a systematic use of data to create knowledge about one's own practices. So this is a social science strategy. It's an educational research strategy. But it's really about, as Ella Baker said, the civil rights leader who said, you know, cast your buckets where you stand. You know, like, you can do this work in your own work, like where you can make a difference. And so you see noted here, increased credit accumulation by race, ethnicity, increased degree attainment, transfer. So looking at disaggregated data as a general routine of practice, an organizational routine that becomes institutionalized, so that no matter what best practices you choose to adopt, you're developing the habit of best practitioners who are going to be engaged in inquiry as a cultural practice, as an institutionalized commitment to ensuring that what you're doing is not reproducing inequities. All right, so we have this, these lovely figurines or figures here, and it represents the convening of the evidence team at Old Main University. And I mentioned that Stella Ben-Simon and I met with the provost, all 14 provosts. So one of those provosts, let's call her Provost Margaret Knight at Old Main. She was one of the ones in that meeting of 14 provosts. And we said, Provost Knight, what you do next is bring together this group of 12 people and think about the people on your campus who are like respected, who are active in governance, who are active in your planning efforts, who have authority, who can reach the faculty, who can reach staff, who can reach your admissions offices, your financial aid. Like, who's controlling the money and who's controlling what counts as quality, right? Quality in assessment, in degree completion, et cetera. So she appointed 2 team leaders, Alejandra Castillo, a vice president of academic and student affairs, or I should, appointed is not the right word. She invited them. She invited them with a lot of like fanfare and a lot of signaling of support and showing what a supported and important effort this would be. And Liz Michaels, a faculty member, who had already served on a retention committee with Alejandra Castillo. So the 2 of them had a working relationship. They'd already shown an interest by serving on the retention committee. And that committee began the work of the equity scorecard. So as we move here, we have a group of other folks now, as you can see, playing out here, like randomly. We have a bunch of more people being added to the team. And they were selected strategically to have a college dean involved, a department chair in STEM, a student advising staff member. Very important, Professor Owen Walker. He was a department chair. And he'll play a pivotal role in the story here. And Professor Teresa Sample, she was responsible for the academic advising of undeclared majors. And the 2 of them worked together on this evidence team. And they charged with, guided with, and under the leadership of Alejandra Castillo and Liz Michaels, participated in a series of meetings where they looked at vital signs. The vital signs of access to their institution, of retention, persistence, graduation, and they became engaged around access perspective. And they wanted to understand what's happening between access initially and access into declaring a major field of study. And because Teresa Sample had responsibility for advising those students, she knew already that this group of students was not really being observed in any of the strategic planning, but yet that they were a fairly large group of students, and also that it was essentially a segregated group of students, that the disproportionate number of students in the undeclared major were African American students. And so they worked together, and here we are, the case of the undeclared majors. What's going on with these undeclared majors? What is it that keeps them from making progress from their initial entry into Old Main University to getting into the major? Now, why is this important to get into a major? Well, as it turns out, the majors have like 10 times the amount of advising resources as the undeclared majors. They have an advisor in the field. They have extracurricular and co-curricular activities. They have a peer group. They have lots of rich resources that help them define their identity, not just as a college student, but to envision a future career and to understand themselves as a successful college student. Teresa Sample describes the undeclared students as being in no man's land. They're in no man's land. They're neglected. And so in this case, they said, well, why? And they began to dig into their data. So the process that I've described so far, when we think about the 5, this is a representation of the inquiry process of the equity scorecard as a 5-stage model of producing knowledge to address inequities. So laying the groundwork, that was Professor Knight calling together the evidence team, identifying faculty leaders and administrative leaders, creating a structure of the data use to actually begin to pinpoint gaps. Defining the problem, they saw that undeclared majors were not making progress to the majors, and that became implicated then in equity gaps in retention because such a disproportionate number of their African American students were caught up in the undeclared major status. So then they began to assess the interventions, the existing resources that were actually in place for students. And they saw that they had a policy in place that students admitted under certain access programs could only take 12 credits. And when the students only took 12 credits, it put them behind schedule versus their peers who were taking 16 credits towards timely progress to graduation and timely progress towards being able to declare a major. So this seems like a rather small thing, but it illustrates the idea that there was an access program in place that was well-intentioned. It was intended to promote diversity, but the design of it was ineffective. So they addressed that, and they began to engage in curricular reform. Alejandra Castillo served on the curriculum committee. She changed the requirements in order to enable a different policy of credit accumulation. Also, so there was a requirement to enter the majors based on SAT score, and that SAT score was higher than the SAT score to get into the university. So in effect, like, you're our student, kind of, but not really. We haven't really accepted you yet as our student. And so they engaged around this issue from an equity-minded perspective, which is to say, if we treat these students like it's not our students, you know, how is this fair? How is this fair? And the deficit-minded view of it was, well, they're, you know, okay, students coming through special access program, they're not motivated, they're not able, et cetera, et cetera. And like, no, we actually design these policies that are disadvantaging them here, that dig in the hole deeper here on campus, right? So they had a workshop, and they invited all the department chairs from across campus, and they brought them data that was this fine-grained, disaggregated data, and they asked them to look at their majors. Well, how many majors are in physics who are African American? How many are in philosophy? How many are over in communication? And how many, you know, are like really, and when some of the department chairs saw the number of students in undeclared majors, they said, well, who are all these students? Like, they didn't know that they were there. So they were essentially invisible. So this work will benefit all students. Any student caught up in these policies and poor practices will be at a disadvantage. But it has a negative disparate impact because of perceptions of lack of ability that are racialized, that are based in racial discrimination. That made it sort of okay that these students were stuck there, that there wasn't a perspective of responsibility. So the team worked together to reframe, and I mentioned Owen Walker, the department chair. I interviewed Owen Walker, and I asked him, you know, well, what about your department? You know, and he said, yeah, we actually did have an SAT score requirement. I said, well, why did you have that SAT score requirement? He said, you know, I really don't know. I don't know why we had it. I said, well, does it matter? You know, like, do you have data that shows that students who are above that threshold are more successful? He was like, no, we didn't actually. He said, it probably made sense at one time, but I don't know why we had it. He said, the fact is we're turning away more students than we're admitting into our major. And so he began a process with his faculty colleagues to change that. And it wasn't such an easy process because they had to reallocate. They realized they'd have more students in classes. They had to meet the prereqs. They had, you know, there was quite some redesign that had to go on. But they engaged in that from a position of moral agency, that this is our responsibility. They took ownership because the data became actionable. So this idea of assessing interventions is saying, okay, well, you know, how do we move from a deficit-minded to an equity-minded perspective? Then they began to implement solutions. So if you're a department chair and you're filing your paperwork with the curriculum committee now at Old Main, if you want to have an SAT score requirement, well, you're going to have to explain why, say that it's a valid measure, and have other indicators by which students can enter your major. So over a 4-year period at Old Main, a third of the departments changed their curricular policies to enable more students to gain access to those fields of study. And remember, that's gaining access to more resources and to richer networks and community and sense of relationship and belonging. Now, the key here, of course, would be to continue to evaluate the results over time. And that's the part that is very challenging. They also embedded in their strategic plan commitment to the closing equity gaps that they had observed in retention. And each person on the team played some role at some level in determining how they could address the problem. So equity as a standard of practice is distinct from respect and inclusiveness and the commitment to diversity. So equity as a standard of practice looks at institutional structures, cultures, practices, and routines, and says how can we create the third way that's going to serve all of our students and close equity gaps. All right, so I'm kind of motoring along here, and I mentioned that at Old Main University that there was a STEM faculty member involved and there was a department chair involved. Well, by the time I went to study them with this wonderful funding from the Spencer Foundation to say, hey, what's going on here? We did the scorecard, we did the training, we disaggregated the data, we set the vital signs, we made equity goals. And I went, and I never had a chance to talk with anyone from STEM. And that suggested to me that they were less engaged in the process because the other members of the evidence team, despite the fact that we were gone as sort of colleagues, partners in the process, we were back home in LA, that they were still meeting with each other. They were still strategizing. They were still looking to the field around them to bring in resources to address this problem. And the STEM folks weren't present. And so STEM fields do pose a particular challenge because cultural perspectives are not how they're socialized in their work as faculty members. So then we need to think about STEM in particular. And at Aurora Community College, here's James Gray. James Gray is the department chair of the math department at Community College of Aurora. And he came to this equity scorecard work, similar to what I described. The provost, the president said, hey, James, we really want a math department chair. Remember, we talked about that strategic formation of this evidence team. James, we'd really like a math to be represented here. It's so important. It's so key to everyone's success. And he's like, well, okay, I'm a good guy. Well, sure, I'll participate. He was not so engaged in this work to begin with. But after 2 years of working with the data, and thinking in this reflective manner from an equity-minded perspective, he came to call himself a first-generation equity worker. He embraced this new identity and this new role because he was motivated by the recognition that he himself had contributed to this problem, which so often we kind of attribute to factors outside the walls of the college. And you see James there. He's standing in front of a workshop, pad of paper with notes, and it actually says cultural competency, equity-themed flex workshops, data and root cause exercises. So he became a colleague who engaged in outreach and instruction and peer mentoring. So what did he do to do that? Here he is with the equity scorecard team. He had a co-team leader, Libby Klingsmith, and Libby is from the Student Affairs part of the college, and they began to think about their cultural practices in math as well as in other settings, but James led the math focus. And so what are the cultural practices in math, and how do we, I love this one. All right, what are the cultural practices in math? And so at the Center for Urban Education, this slide, I've used this slide for 8 years now. It goes way back to the California Benchmarking Project. And then during the California Benchmarking Project, we invited community college colleagues at LA Southwest College, Long Beach City College, and Rio Hondo College to do this inquiry work and address equity gaps. And it was the math faculty department at LA Southwest College that brought this cartoon into our conversation. And we thought it captured so well the idea that there are cultural practices that are intended to send students away. So they teach pre-algebra in the community colleges. And literally, on their pre-algebra syllabus, the information for students about how do you get your grade was in an algebraic formula. And so, this represents this kind of gotcha mentality. And it's like, well, why? Like, why? We're going to ask that question again and again. Why are those our cultural practices? How can we do it differently? All right. And so it's on the syllabus. So what did James and his colleagues do with the evidence team? And not only with the evidence team, but with others, they looked at their syllabus as a cultural practice. They did peer observations in each other's classrooms to say, well, how is it that we're welcoming students to class or not welcoming them to class? And they did observe that the syllabus might say one thing, all these like harsh rules, a lot of compliance, command and control language, very controlling language, wanting to tell students what you have to do. If you don't do that, like a contract, They did see that, but then in the classroom, students weren't being held accountable, like in relationship, like, hey, you came in late, we missed you, we're getting going, come on, let's get to work, like in relationship to be holding each other accountable, to learning, to teaching and learning. And one of the professors, so as they engaged in this process of peer observation, syllabus review, peer mentoring, they did, and they said, well, how are students experiencing the syllabus? How are they experiencing the assignments we give? What sense do they have of their belonging or lack of belonging here? They said, well, let's look and think about, let's use a process by which we really break down our numbers. And this actually represents, in this particular case, transfer students. But what I wanted to show here more generally was the idea of breaking down the numbers so that each one of them could look at their own data, section by section by section, in their pre-algebra class. And they did this, and they disaggregated their data, and they made tables like this one, not this specific one, but like this one. And they found that some sections, some teachers were underperforming teachers. So we talk about underperforming students or at-risk students. They talk about at-risk professors. And they switched it around, and they said, oh, some of us are underperforming. But as painful as that was for some faculty, they didn't leave it at that. They worked together to improve. And they chose a focal effort to increase the completion rates for African Americans and Hispanics. And they did that because the data showed them that that's the work they needed to do. And they used these inquiry processes of qualitative data use to get a better understanding of what they need to do. So they, this is what I was thinking of before, but this woman here, Laura, so Laura came to realize that she wasn't holding her African-American students to high expectations. And if we think of the kind of the cultural messages that are very prevalent in our society and the popular media, there's a sense of difference and othering that's occurring. Especially as we look at the issues of police violence and brutality and the killings of black men, that is really creating a heightened tension. And Laura realized that she was afraid of approaching some of her students. And she called herself to task to do things differently. And in this workshop, we have 35 math professors gathered to look at the data, to understand these practices, and to understand the powerful influence of cultural scripts about how people will act or not act in appropriate or inappropriate ways as college students. And she tasked herself to call all of her students to high standards. And she realized that she herself had been exercising a lack of accountability by having implicit bias and also by not holding her students to the belief that they could succeed. So she really told that story, and here's the whole group of math faculty at the Community College of Aurora. At the end of our two-day workshop that was funded by the National Science Foundation, we wanted to thank them and celebrate the journey that they'd been on to change their cultural practices in math. Now, they now are mentoring their colleagues in chemistry. And so the president there is really committed to the work. And now, with funding from the Gates Foundation and Teagle Foundation, we're going to be working beyond Community College of Aurora to 3 other community colleges. Front Range, Community College of Denver, and Ames Community College. And this gives us the opportunity to show, like, this is the way it's done now. This is the state of the art. We're going to do some social norming. And that's some of what you can do here in your own institution. Now, so this has quite a bit of information on it. And maybe it's a bit much for late in the day. But what I wanted to represent and what this slide shows is I'm not focusing on the numbers here, but just on the trend lines. The colored lines are different racial and ethnic groups. And so there are gaps in success rates. This is course by course rate completion in the math curriculum. And so we're going along. And so for semester, we have gaps where black students are represented here in blue, Hispanic in red, white students in green. And there was a project called Equity and Excellence. The Lieutenant Governor of Colorado asked all the colleges to get involved in redesigning their curriculum, shortening it. That's a structural change that's very important, right? Just like the structural change over at Old Main was very important. Serves all students better, and it reduces those disparate negative impacts. So that was good because, look, the success rates are going up. That's great. The success rates are going up. But what else is happening? The gaps are staying the same. White students are still succeeding at a higher rate than the other groups. So the equity gaps have not been addressed by this structural reform. The structural reform didn't do the work of addressing implicit bias. It didn't do the work of changing pedagogy. And it didn't do the reflective practice work of inquiry and of the scorecard. So once they did the equity scorecard and the work that Laura did, reflecting on her own practices, her relationships with her students, and her ability, tasking herself to reach out to her African American students and to be in relationship with them for their success, they were able to close the equity gaps. So that's a great success story because the gaps close. I think that illustrates here. Yeah, so you see the gaps closing, and they're very, very narrow differences. Now, the question comes up, always surprises me a little bit, but it usually does come up, hey, what happened to those white students? Don't we care about them anymore? Don't worry, we care about white students too. I'm white, obviously, I care about white students. And so when I talk about the third way in developing cultural practices, I'm talking about addressing racial discrimination. I'm not talking about creating new forms of discrimination. And I asked James, what accounts for that drop right there? If 2 more white students had been successful here, it would be back to closed, right? That's a very, very small number. And also, equity gaps are only defined in the social and historical context of discrimination. So we need to understand what are the causes of the gaps to begin with. Not all gaps are caused by discrimination. Okay, well, a big question that always comes up is buy-in. Like, well, we've all been doing this work, but we have a lot of folks who are not here in the room. They're not so interested in this, and this is not what they're thinking about. And it is a very charged environment to talk about race in this country today. So what about buy-in? So I represent the idea that buy-in is fostered in different ways. And I think about it as like, so knowing, feeling, and doing. So head, heart, and hands. So some of you may come to this work from the heart. Maybe you yourself are a person of color, and you've experienced that racial discrimination, and you know that these practices exist. You know that they need to be changed in order to make a more equitable system. Others are coming at it from that justice is care perspective. I see all students the same, I don't see race. Okay, but that's where they're starting from. So that's a starting point to engage in the conversation. That justice is care. Now, how do we move from justice is care to transformation? Part of the strategy of the equity scorecard and of action research and inquiry in general is to get people working with the data to think about, well, how many more students are we talking about here? Well, what could we do? Well, is that so hard? Well, does that really cost so much? Isn't that something we can do? And even if people are a bit grudging or you haven't really come to consensus, you can get people getting their hands going. Let's do the redesign. We need to do it for these other reasons anyway. So there's a bit of push-pull to get people involved. So buy-in is fostered knowing, feeling, doing. Some people are interested in the abstractions and the discussions around equity. Some people are interested in the curriculum redesign. And so it's always that negotiation process playing out in groups over and over and over again. And each time you have a new entrant to the process, it's important to try to draw out what's the motivation. What's the motivation that will involve them in a deeper way. Okay, leadership is key at all levels. I have met many wonderful leaders here at University of Delaware, and so I think you're poised to begin this work in a very productive way. I mentioned the Lieutenant Governor of Colorado, that's Joseph Garcia, here he is, who initiated the Equity and Excellence project and then was a partner to us in the equity scorecard work. And this is Betsy Oudenhoven. The woman in the middle is the president of the Community College of Aurora. And so leadership at all levels is key. We had the department chair, we had the president, we had the lieutenant governor. That's why Community College of Aurora is a success story. Old Main University is a success story because they were a high-performing team. This was a team that had previous relationships with each other. They trusted each other. They took the time to talk about the data. They worked through the data. And they each took responsibility for some piece of it. It wasn't like the Office of Diversity and Inclusion was responsible for equity in and of, on their own. And so being strategic about how do we bring in new people who might not be the usual suspects of equity and diversity work is important to sustain this whole. Oh, and there's James over there. And I actually do not know who this woman is. Okay. All right. So to recap, equity-mindedness involves noticing racial disparities and being able to talk about them, to name them, and to do so in a way that doesn't lead to, that doesn't end the conversation. So there's an adage attributed to Confucius that says, the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their right name. So racial inequities have a root cause. And so identifying that root cause in discrimination and racism is the beginning of wisdom. And we cannot see these racial inequities unless we disaggregate the data. And it's messy, it's not perfect. We have multi-ethnic students. We have reasons why some students don't want to fill out that form. But it's clear that racism exists, and so that racial equity, racially disaggregated data is necessary in order to monitor our progress. Acknowledging that practices may not be working. This is really rooted in practice. Understanding inequity as an institutional dysfunction, not a dysfunction of students. It's an institutional dysfunction, and we have the creativity, we have the resources, we do have the know-how to address this dysfunction. Not letting stereotypes be the answer to the existence of gaps, the why, really rooting it in data, and taking action to eliminate inequities. So your brain will look like this. After all, you'll be institutionally focused, race-conscious, evidence-based, equity advancing, and systemically aware. Isn't that exciting? Okay. All right. So this is the last slide, and I put it here. It sort of encapsulates the equity scorecard process as a 5-phase inquiry process that starts by convening, laying the groundwork, see the broken path, that's the inequity, identify that problem in data, figure out what we are doing, what can we do better, and then results hopefully will be more equitable outcomes. So thank you so much for letting me share this journey that I've been on involving the equity scorecard. I have said we, and Estella Bensimon, of course, is a big part of this work. She continues that work. I continue to work with her. And there's a group of staff and doctoral students at Center for Urban Ed as well. And so this is a very collaborative process, and I just wanted to emphasize that we is a very real, it's not the royal we, it's a real group of people who've been collaborative in this work. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention, and thank you for having me.
We have lots of time for questions and discussion, so we'll open up the floor.
It's not a very big question.
Okay.
But I'd like to hear more about the professors in the math department that were identified as bad. You wouldn't have used that term. That's my term. But
We didn't say bad, no.
where their outcomes, the outcomes for the students in their classrooms weren't as good as other professors. And I'd like to hear more about what behaviors they changed to make that better. And do you know the specific things that were they able to, especially this female math professor in that photo, what did she do differently that she wasn't doing before?
Yeah.
Maybe that's just idiosyncratic, but I'm really interested.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So the math professor's name is Laura, and she told this story publicly, and she acknowledged that she was an underperforming faculty member in this respect. She described her pain. You know, she said, I went home and cried for 2 days. You know, I felt like I realized that I had been contributing to this problem and that I had acted in a way that was discriminatory. And so some of you may be familiar with this notion of white tears. It's kind of a critique of when white people recognize these problems and recognize their role in it, that then their emotional journey starts to play center stage. And that's, you know, so it's the critique of, well, this, you know, now we're all about white tears. Well, come on, we've known this already. Get over it. Let's do the work. And so to Laura's credit, although she did experience that emotional upheaval because she felt like she was a failure, she engaged in a series of what I'll call design experiments. So pedagogical experiments in her own classroom. So one of the things she used to do is she would tell her students, like, these are all the risk factors, and if you're working more than 20 hours a week, if you're doing this, like, those are all risk factors, and you should stop doing them. Like, you know, if you're married with children, that's a risk factor. Stop doing it. You know, and she realized, well, she looked at the data, and she actually discovered, well, her working parents the data didn't bear out what she was saying, first of all. She saw that, and she threw out that exercise, and she designed other exercises. And so in the picture where it showed the room of people listening to Laura, she shared specific activities. And I'm sorry that I can't remember the specifics of them, but it was essentially thinking about how did she engage her students together? How did she engage with them? How did she sequence the assignments? And then she went back to the data again, went back to the data again. Like after each redesign of an activity, she would look at the data. So they have a lot of sections, and they teach the class semester after semester. So one semester after another and one assignment after another, she was gathering data. And she did it in collaboration with her faculty peers. So James, as department chair, required all the faculty, part-time and full-time, to do equity mentoring with each other. And so I don't know that they knew, like we were in the room with them when we talked about underperforming faculty, because we say that because we want to point to, like, you know, these underperforming students it's a teaching and learning relationship, right? So if your students are underperforming, in a sense, the professor is underperforming. And it's just a reshifting. So equity-minded versus deficit-minded, it's a cognitive shift, and these are cognitive tools. And so Laura shared her story because she wanted to illustrate the power of this shift in thinking, and that she acted in a professional manner in order to redesign what she was doing. And she did it in collaboration with her colleagues. And I think that's really important. The collaborative piece of it, where they were working together, was very important.
So just to ask a follow-up question, so the disaggregated equity-minded data would be for every professor who teaches every section of that course, they would be tracking their outcomes of Black, white, Latino students every section. Would that be the idea, that if the underperforming professor would be one who's got a bigger gap between the two groups?
Yeah.
Between privilege and under...
Yeah, who had equity gaps within the section.
Equity gaps.
And I agree with, I gasped when I heard that they did this. And in a unionized environment, it might be very, you know, like not a feasible approach. In many environments, it wouldn't be possible. It's because James and his colleagues had a whole series of meetings where they articulated equity as a value and a goal, and that therefore they were able to do this together. They had a trust with each other that they would be focused on it, not to blame each other, but to make things better. So I think that was a very important aspect of it. But I agree with you, it's a very challenging approach.
You made an important point earlier about the distinction between equity and equality. And I'm wondering how you define underperforming from an equity perspective as opposed to an equality perspective. Is there a predictive model that says they should be performing here, but they're performing here? Or is it simply the fact that they have a different graduation rate or retention rate?
In terms of students,
yeah,
like underperforming students, how do we
how do you determine that they're underperforming?
Let me think. So when we we tend to not use the word underperforming in relation to students. And I agree with the premise of the question, like, well, maybe it's not so good to seem to call faculty underperforming either, although we found it a useful device in that setting. So I guess maybe I could, a question that's often posed is, well, but isn't it true that some students are more prepared than others? And so if students who are less prepared perform at a lower level, isn't that a real phenomenon? Don't we have to deal with that too? And so I think it is important to acknowledge not everyone's coming with equal level of participation. And so if you take an equality perspective, like I treat all students equally, then I think it's an implied point of view that the source of underpreparedness is always the same, for students coming through the door, when the source of underpreparedness is not the same. Or the source of the source of a student's capacity to demonstrate their ability is not the same, or the environment doesn't equally foster the capability to show the capacity to show ability. I think that looking at measures and saying, can we design a way that casts a wider net in our measurement of ability, right? So that we're not using measures that are systematically, persistently reproducing inequitable outcomes. So I don't think you can talk about underperforming students in a way that's equitable without acknowledging structural inequality. That's the source of inequities to begin with. One point that I find very helpful is the idea that human talents and abilities are normally distributed across all racial and ethnic groups. Like it's just, it's a natural fact. So human talents and abilities are normally distributed. In all populations, there are some more talented at this and some less talented at this. Some better in math, some better at writing, whatever it might be. But if we see these equity gaps persistently by race and ethnicity, it's not due to that group. It's due to something in our history and in our current practices that are reproducing this systemic and persistent problem. So if that normal distribution isn't occurring, then there's some practice that's creating.
So to some extent, defining the problem occurs perhaps earlier than identifying what we might call underperformance. So if the problem is lack of preparation, that's a different solution, implementation or design question than performing lower on academic activities.
Yes. So I mentioned before the idea of horizontal equity. To those with equal needs, equal resources. The counterpart to that is vertical equity. To those with greater needs, greater resources. And this is part of the thinking, the thinking part of Buyin, which is, can we formulate a conception of equity in justice, such as the philosopher John Rawls, who has a theory of justice. And so John Rawls talks about justice as fairness, and conceptualizes what are the standards and practices of a just society. Well, to those who have greater needs, give more. So to those who have ability but haven't been well educated, give more resources because they do have the ability. I'm not sure if I got the.
Oh yeah, you got.
What were the demographics of the schools that you guys did the recognition at? And another question on top of that is, to do something like that at Delaware, wouldn't you have to have a larger sample size to do that on? For like a population of 7 to 8% white to 5% black and like 3% Latino, like I don't know about the percentages, but something like that. Wouldn't you isn't there a bigger problem from even going to higher education in the first place?
Access, like a problem that precedes access.
We talked about how just about like it comes before that, but doesn't it come before to get to that place of higher education to have that reform? You would need a larger sample size to do it on.
Okay. Well, this is an interesting set of questions, and so Old Main University, I would say, is somewhat more diverse than University of Delaware. But many institutions are less diverse. Like we did a lot of work in the University of Wisconsin. And Madison, Milwaukee, these are more diverse areas of Wisconsin, but the outer UWs and the rest of the state are not diverse at all. And so this work has been carried out in places with sort of a that are diverse and some that are not diverse at all. And each time then it really needs to be thought through in the local context. So it's not as though University of Delaware is not diverse enough to do the work. In fact, because I think you could become more diverse, that therefore it's a good place to do this type of work. In regard to sample size, so there are different types of educational research or social science research. Some social science research is based on statistical sampling. And in that kind of a paradigm or approach to research, then we make inferences. We take a sample and we make an inference. We draw a conclusion about a larger population. And therefore, you need a large sample size. And it's due to the statistical assumptions that are made and how you can draw a sound conclusion using statistics. But when we do action research, that's not the type of research that's being done. So small n, the small cell sizes, the small sample size, it's not a sample size, it's just a small number of people. Small n, that's the actionable n. That's where we can say, well, if we only have 5, why not 10? Like if we only have 10, why not 20? Like we can really relate those small n to practice. And so the sample size issue does not plague action research. It has other challenges, but not that. And the standard of credibility by which to judge action research is not statistical significance. It's what we call catalytic validity. Catalytic validity is, did you learn something from this that made you change the way you do what you do? Catalytic. Did it catalyze you to do something different? I think I got most of your questions then. Okay. Did I miss one? Well, I mean, I certainly agree that this work can and should be done at earlier levels of education. We did do, for example, this equity scorecard process as a pilot in the Boston Public Schools. And it's very similar process of inquiry, learning about how they use their counseling resources and how they were using external providers of college counseling. And just, how that was working or not working and how it had negative disparate impacts. So we can do the same work in K-12. But the fact that it hasn't been done in K-12 should not keep us from doing the work in higher ed. So remember digging the hole? I mean, we're digging the hole here. We're digging, it's like the hole is being dug in lots of places. And so we should be addressing it in lots of places. Evidence teams, and sometimes they have been called inquiry teams. And I kind of like that better, honestly. But yes, either way.
And how you want to assemble them strategically. But is there also a critical mass of proportion to the greater population? Is there a critical number of people to be on that team?
A typical number on evidence teams that we've brought together is 10 to 12. And yes, yeah. Sometimes there are multiple teams. We did have a project at Long Beach City College where there were 2 teams and they engaged in slightly different work. Sometimes there was an institution, Los Medanos College, that had one team that addressed transfer issues, another addressed developmental education curriculum issues. So the key here is not so much the number as that if people are being asked to learn on behalf of their institutions and then go out and give presentations, speak on behalf of the initiative, share questions, share findings, that they need a kind of a group that's large enough to bring different perspectives functionally and in terms of racial, ethnic background and experiences, and to kind of work out their expertise in a small enough, it's like a large enough group but a small enough group. Right, so that if I am talking with a math professor, I have to translate from my educational research world to the math professor's professional world. So that's why it's been at that number. If you get into a larger group, it's just harder to schedule, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, but I'm assuming that the sizes of like Old Main and Aurora are pretty different.
Yes, Aurora is a small institution, and Old Main's.
If you have 10 to 12 people at Aurora working, you've got a pretty good chunk of the faculty versus 10 to 12 people at Old Main working. Do you see the same level of impact in each case?
So the two cases also illustrate different approaches. So Old Main engaged in sort of an institution-wide scan that started with their retention committee, and then retention committee got charged to look at access. Back to this question here, like, well, we're looking at retention, but maybe we should back up and look at access. So, so they did kind of a broad scan, and I'm trying to think about. So those individuals also acted through in other places, like the Strategic Planning Committee, the Curriculum Governance Committee. So they brought strategies, they brought findings to other settings as well. So the idea is to strategically bring that team together, and they're people who can then carry the work forward. And in the context of James at the Community College of Aurora, there it became very focused on math because we had the ability to focus on math, and that was chosen as the focal point when they looked at their data. So they started through the the Lieutenant Governor's Initiative, Equity and Excellence. They started with an institution-wide focus, and then this math focus took shape because they had the data, they saw the gaps, and they designed a strategy. Some other work was done across the institution, but it became focused there. So the idea of a focal effort, I believe, is important. And if you make a commitment to the work over time, you can choose certain focal efforts and tackle those focal efforts and illustrate what does it mean to do this work before everybody at the whole university is involved. Because because it's a process of learning and organizational learning, it does take time. And learning must be preceded by unlearning, or these two go together. So, therefore, the focal effort is important. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about?
Can you talk a little bit? So the examples illustrated how the people at the institution, what are they called, the evidence team?
Yeah.
How the evidence team members were involved in sort of what they were doing. I'm curious to know how the Center for Urban Education folks, how you supported that and like what you added to what they were doing.
Yes. So when the Center for Urban Education partners with an institution to carry out the equity scorecard action research process, the institution is assigned a project specialist. And the project specialist is somebody who's familiar with the action research protocols that have been designed at the center. So we talked about the syllabus review and looking at a syllabus as a cultural artifact. So there's an actual protocol that we've used in, I would say, at least 20 different settings by now that sort of spells out how to use this protocol. So ideally, it would occur in a series of workshops of 3 to 4 hours each, and there would be a group of faculty who would be, so in that case, syllabus is for faculty, but there are other documents. You could have your admissions people look at their admissions documents. And that would play out over a 3-month period, and then there are a series of indicators by which the prompts are made to the team where you say, does this syllabus reflect this series of values? So it's like respect, it's active learning, and it's empowerment, so a series of indicators. And so those tools are provided in order that the group of people who are on the evidence team don't have to create the activity. Because if you're so busy making the activity, agreeing on the activity, you have lots of different ideas, it's kind of like, well, let's try this model and drive it. Let's get a hang of it. Like, what does it mean to be on this journey? How does it work? After that, people start doing their own thing, so then they, each place starts to make their own tools, they adapt. And that's okay because it's custom. You know, it's meant to be locally owned. You know, but providing the protocols and providing a structure and a series of steps so that this idea of buy-in occurs through, you know, head, heart, and hands, is that there's this hands piece, this activity piece that's designed. It's been field tested. If it doesn't work for you, we'll be like, oh, we're really sorry, that did not work for you. We're going to try something else, you know. And you know, being partners in a design process, it's a process of experimentation, much as you would if you're a you know, teacher in a classroom and you see that this worked or that didn't work, that, you know, the things that worked you do again, the things that didn't work you throw out. So it's like field tested activities, you know. And that case studies, models, connections to peers. When we did what we called a kickoff meeting in the old Maine University system, right, where we brought 150 people together, and that was preceded by a team leaders institute or kickoff meeting. So the team leaders came together, and the team leaders were actually given the data before they met with their teams. They were given agendas for the first meeting. Like, here's your agenda. You know, you want to look at your data in this way, and here's a worksheet to look at the data. And when we brought the team leaders together, we had some UW team leaders, so University of Wisconsin team leaders beamed in, you know, by video, and they talked about their experiences, and they you know, were doing Q&A, and that was important because it was like real people like me, you know, who had done it. Like, what am I being asked to do here? That's part of it. It's a little bit uncommon, not rare as we see, but a little bit different. And so, and in fact, the question about sample size comes up again and again and again. And there's usually someone trained in statistics who wants to address the statistical significance question. This is not significant. This is not significant. Maryam, this is not significant. But it doesn't need to be significant because we want to get to catalytic validity. It's significant if you learn something and you act on it. Okay, so what do we do? Telephone mediated or Adobe Connect mediated meetings. A project facilitator can participate in meetings. Meetings with team leaders, phone calls, check-ins, that type of thing. And institutes, Q-host institutes, things like that.
Hi. So my question kind of follows a little bit from Rosalie. I'm really interested in how administrators actually support faculty and staff in doing the work. And by that, I mean things like what resources, what material conditions can they, have you witnessed? Because one of the things that I've experienced here is that, you know, James, directing the Center for the Study of Diversity, there's so many ideas and so many projects and so many questions, and then there's just really limited, you know, avenues for faculty to say, yes, I will suspend my current research activity and dive into this. And I mean, to some extent, it feels like what you're suggesting can only really be done by full professors who are so I'm thinking about material conditions, resources, and I would just love to hear you talk a little more about what you've seen or what has worked well in supporting people in doing this work.
So when we convene the evidence team, we generally don't ask assistant professors to participate if they're on the tenure track, because the concern would be that the work is not rewarded when it comes to tenure. And so we are aware of there's a political economy of institutions and rewards. So then people with tenure, if you may already have a research agenda, well, you don't have time. So most of us have a service requirement, some type of service commitments or requirements. So we try to make this part of service. And so, for example, Liz Michaels was on the retention committee. That was already part of her service commitment. And people who serve on faculty council, they already have a service commitment. Department chairs have a service, they have an administrative. So this idea of like, who are the boundary spanners who are already doing service work or other work that would make them be able to synthesize or to bring their work together. Liz Michaels had already been doing research on, she's a psychologist, and she was doing research around what's the climate, what's the racial climate on campus. So this work connected with her research agenda. And when I interviewed her, 3 years later, 4 years later, she kept saying, well, if I didn't have this other research that I was doing, I would do this, this, and this next with the equity scorecard. And if I didn't have this other research, I would do this, this, and this. But the thing is, she did those things anyway. So, so what happened was that the motivation became part of her identity as a faculty member at that institution. And so what did she do? She actually began to look at racial equity gaps in a gatekeeper course in her field, in psychology. So it was a big course, and there were racial equity gaps in that course. So she brought it to her own course. Then she created like a tutoring and academic resource center. And as they brought new faculty into the department, she basically said, that's what we're all doing. This is what we all do here. We all hold hours in the center. Like, that's just the way we do it here. And then she lobbied the president, and she got space. They got from one space to another. So it became part of her way of being as a professor. And the provost acknowledged, her contributions. She did have a course waiver, I think, for a few semesters. And as that came to a close, she felt less able to spend time. So I think it's very important, and I think course waivers, service recognition, what's called visible actions of support on a leadership level, celebrations and rewards and newsletters, PR, like, let's make, faculty fellows, whatever kind of institutional reward structures you have, sometimes compensation in terms of money. We haven't seen that very often, not surprisingly. But sometimes there's a little bit of wiggle room with the teaching load, and other times it's service. Was there someone before?
Maybe 2 more questions.
Back to you. Was there someone before?
Thank you. So everyone looked at me over there when you talked about statistics.
I can talk statistics too. Come on.
I'm actually interested in the participatory part. I've never done PAR, but so you're measuring closing the equity gap through, I'm guessing grades or academic performance. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, are you also including students in this process and asking them, like, since this was implemented, how have you felt more connected to your faculty or felt more engaged to the syllabus? Or also look at, like, what's driving their own intrinsic motivation in addition to what the institution is doing through the equity scorecard?
The students' intrinsic motivation?
Mm-hmm. Like, in addition to that, like, is it bolstered by it?
So the short answer is no, which would be like a miracle if I stopped there, right? We haven't included students in a very active way, in part because the theory of change of the equity scorecard is based in what's called practice theory. So it's a theory of practice and of practitioner learning. And so reflective practice, inquiry, these are ideas that are rooted in ideas about how do we produce knowledge. And this is not to say students don't produce knowledge. But when we talk about institutional responsibility, it's of the practitioner's responsibility. We did at one team had a student who was a member of the evidence team. That didn't go so well because the student was sort of an up by your bootstraps, I did it, why can't they? Like, this was a student of color who felt like, well, I did it, why can't everyone else? And so it was hard to engage the student in this kind of equity-minded work that's a practice-based theory. We have had success, though. For example, we've worked with faculty to interview students who are not in their own classes. So there was a project, math faculty were involved with one of our researchers, a doctoral student, who interviewed students who'd been in their classrooms, and then they brought that interview data back to the faculty. And then they talked together about that data. So that's a model that works within this. It's not asking the students themselves, but gather data. And Dr. Dow has a storytelling project. One of the things I think would be very interesting would to link those stories to particular practice settings. So, when you moved from this classroom to that classroom, what happened? Or in this service, when you went for financial aid, what did you experience? So that it's linking the story to the place, to the practice. And then bring that to the faculty. We've had faculty interview students. That's harder. There's a lot more work involved. The other thing that we did, have you ever seen one of these exercises where there's a group of people and you all stand up, and if you have a certain identity that's a privileged identity, you step forward, and if you have one that's a not privileged identity, you step backwards. So we had, we filmed students doing that exercise. Students at a specific college, and so they did, and the pattern emerged. And then the faculty did that, and a different pattern emerged. And then the faculty viewed that exercise that the students had done. And so they saw the very different, their assumptions were challenged in many different ways by seeing the students play through that exercise. So there are all kinds of creative things that can be done to bring student voice, student perspective into the process. Oh, did he leave? Yeah. Oh.
Evidence team.
Yes.
Do you believe that it's important that the evidence team, the demographics of that, look similar to the demographics of the school that they represent? And I ask because I feel like a lot of times when we look at issues, we kind of look at them from an outside-in perspective instead of inside-out. So I was just wondering if you think that's important.
I do think that's important, yes. I think it's important to have a diverse group of evidence team members. And yes, I do think that's important.
And then, like, when these evidence teams were being constructed, did you guys take that into account, or were they kind of just constructed randomly?
We did convene the evidence teams with race consciousness, and we did ask also the provosts, who are the ones who think about, who do I have in my institution who can do this work? But at the same time, we don't only invite people of color to this work, because James is white, he's the math department chair. He's able to play a pivotal role because he has authority as a resource, and he also had the capability to engage people around the process too. So a typical team, well, in that case, it does really depend on the diversity of the institution. At University of Wisconsin, where it's very predominantly white, just not much diversity in many of those far-flung institutions, that then there would be fewer people of color in the teams. But others have had a good mix of diversity.
Well, thank you. We still have some time if you want to engage with Dr. Dowd individually, or if you want to have the book signed or purchase a book, that's also available in the front. But thank you so much for addressing all the questions and helping us in our thinking about equity here at the University of Delaware.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.